Hey everyone, welcome back to Reading with Raptors here at the University of Minnesota Raptor Center. Here in the Twin Cities, it is pretty chilly outside and we're getting a lot of snow, so we are inside. So luckily we got out last week to enjoy some of the great weather. So we're indoors here. We have Artemis, one of our resident peregrine falcons. She is working on a chunk of quail right now. I figured I'd give it to her to start off right away, since we have a pretty good, decently long book to read today. So I wanted to make sure that she had plenty of time to eat and for us to watch. So today we're going to be reading a book that somebody brought in, which was excellent, that is about some of the kind of first big kind of conservation efforts here in North America, specifically here in the US. It's got a lot going on. I'm really excited to read it. It's actually about one of the first kind of really big and longest lasting Audubon societies, and kind of some of the things that led up to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. I know that doesn't sound especially thrilling, but this is really important for a lot of raptors and a lot of other of our native birds and other wildlife. So this is a wonderful, colorful book called She's Wearing a Dead Bird on Her Head. This is by the author Kathryn Lasky and illustrated by David Catrow. So you could tell it's got some really wonderful illustrations with lots of great facial expressions and lots of great bird art. So I'm really excited for this one. So we'll just dive right in. As always, if you have questions that come up while we're reading or while you are watching our resident peregrine falcon, you can go ahead and put those in the chat and I'll kind of scroll back after we're finished reading to catch some of those. So, she's wearing a dead bird on her head. Here's this first illustration right away too, of these birds flying off of this person's hat. And one more. She's wearing a dead bird on her head. Let's find out more. Text is kind of small on this one. Harriet Hemingway was a very proper Boston lady. She never talked with her mouth full. But one day she almost did. Standing by the bay window in her parlor, she had just bitten into a jam cookie when her eyes sprang open in dismay. She gasped, leaned forward, swallowed, then turned to her parlor maid. She's wearing a dead bird on her head. Feathers on ladies' hats were becoming more and more popular. At first, hats had been decorated with just feathers, and then designers began to add pairs of wings. But this woman had an entire bird perched atop her hat. Harriet squinted her eyes as the lady of fashion walked proudly by. "Looks ready to fly away," said the parlor maid. "It won't," Harriet replied sadly. So you can see the scene here in this parlor in Boston, where someone's walking by with a full bird on her hat. What is going on? Harriet felt that she had to do something. Huge populations of birds, from egrets to pheasants to owls to warblers, were being slaughtered for hat decoration. None were spared, not even pigeons. But what could she do? Women in 1896 had very little power. They could not vote, and many had husbands who did not allow them to make decisions for themselves. Some women were not even allowed to read newspapers. Harriet's husband, Augustus, did not treat her this way. But she and other women like her wanted to change things for all women, and she wanted to do something for the birds. Fashion was killing birds as well as killing women's chances to have the right to vote and be listened to. For who would listen to a woman with a dead bird on her head? And if the senseless slaughter for a silly fashion was not stopped, in a few years, the birds with the prettiest feathers would all be dead, gone forever, extinct. I must call Cousin Mina," Harriet said grimly. So here are these people walking by, all sorts of folks with hats with all sorts of different birds on them. Pretty flashy, but very dangerous. Click, 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 click. The heels of Miss Mina Hall's high but toned shoes beat a quick rhythm against the bricks of the sidewalk. Her blue eyes were bright as they searched the bare limbs of the trees that lined the avenue for the yellow finches that appeared like spots of flitting gold on this gray winter day. Their quick golden flight swelled her heart. Click, 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 click. She could not be late for tea at Harriet's. This was too important. Click, 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 click. Miss Hall's feet froze in their tracks. Straight ahead there was indeed a pair of golden wings, but they had neither head nor body attached. They were pinned instead to the crown of a lady's hat, and on the brim was a swirl of snowy egret feathers. So you see this hat with all the feathers and a very disapproving Mina Hall on this very gray day. Revolting! The single word rumbled down Commonwealth Avenue as noisily as a cannonball loose on a ship's deck. Me? The fashionable lady squeaked with dismay. You heartless creature! That a bird should be slaughtered just to make you feel pretty? Ugh! Mina made a scalding sound deep in the back of her throat. Very dismayed individual. She's walking down the rest of the road. Here's someone holding some plucked, looks like roosters maybe. When Mina stormed into the parlor, Harriet was preparing tea. "Well, Harriet," Mina exclaimed as she pulled off her felt cap. "From Arlington Street to Clarendon, 3 egrets, 1 marabou, 2 grebes, 1 golden finch, and..." Mina paused. Her cousin waited nervously, the teacup chattering on the saucer she was holding. "A hummingbird." "Oh no, Mina!" "Oh yes, Harriet. Perched in full flight on a bunch of silk roses with a veil. Disgusting! Revolting! Nauseating! Vile!" The words flew through the air like red-hot cinders. "Well, let's get down to business," Mina said. "Do you have the book?" Here they are, getting ready for tea together, looking very disgruntled, very unhappy. "Yes, right here." Harriet Hemingway walked over to a shelf in the parlor and took down a large blue volume. The words "Boston Social Register" were written across the cover in gold letters. The book was a list of all the grandest families in Boston. They opened the book, and with pencils in hand, they began to scan the list of families, starting with A. Mrs. Appleton, quite fashionable. Indeed, a peafowl with a few warbler feathers at tea last week. Bancroft. Oh, marabou fan and hatch to match at the opera. Finally, they got to Z. Mrs. Zacharias. Egrets and warblers, with a touch of flamingo, I do believe. Luncheon at the Somerset Hotel. So here they are getting down that large book of all of these very wealthy, fashionable families. "Dear, dear," Mina moaned and sipped the last of her tea. "What shall we do?" "Well," Harriet scratched her head, "we have garden clubs and history clubs. Why not form a bird club? Not just to watch birds, no, but to protect them and stop this senseless murdering for fashion." "What a wonderful idea," said Mina. "Let's do it. Let's start a club for the birds." Right then, they began to write letters to all the Boston ladies of fashion who wore the plumage of birds, imploring them to set aside their fancy hats with swirls of owl feathers, breasts of grebes, wings of hummingbirds, and plumes of egrets, and instead join a society dedicated to protecting all birds. This was the first informal meeting of the Audubon Society, named after a man they admired, John Audubon, the famous painter of birds. So here we have all these very fancy individuals with their hats All these different birds on top of them receiving the letters from Harriet and Mina. What is going to happen next? Harriet and Mina were very persuasive. They convinced women not only that killing birds was wrong, but that birds as hat decoration made women look silly. Soon, many of the fashionable ladies of Boston to whom they had written letters did join the society. For the club to accomplish its goals, however, Harriet and Mina knew it also needed men. Smart and powerful men who could vote and go into public places like the state legislatures and the halls of Congress in Washington, D.C. So they asked lawyers and doctors, sportsmen and bird experts to join too. So here we have somebody still walking around with those feathers on their cap. Some people looking on quite disapprovingly. They are not fans of this big fancy hat. So what is this big group of people going to do? At the second meeting of the Audubon Society, Harriet and Mina and the new members made up rules for their club. "I think," said one gentleman, "that there should be an exception made for ducks." "What kind of exception?" Harriet asked. "We want to hunt them," replied another gentleman. "Rules are rules," fumed Mina. "Sportsmen aren't special," another woman said, and stamped her foot. The women won. There would be no killing of ducks or game birds. Then all of the members devised a plan to get the word out on birds to everyone. And the bird hat campaign of the Audubon Society began in earnest. I really like this detail. There's a cat reaching for a spider over here on this chair. I just thought that was a nice little touch. So here's everyone kind of arguing and figuring out what the rules of this club would be, figuring out kind of what those core values of this Audubon Society were going to be. So here they are holding a wood duck. They decided to bring their cause to the children of the state of Massachusetts. So into the schools they went. Mina, Harriet, and other members of the society. In Florida, heaps of birds, stripped of their feathers, are left dying on the ground, Harriet told one class of children, holding up a photograph of a pile of dead egrets. "What happened to their babies, the ones left in the nest?" a student asked. "The ones that are too young to fly are left to die. So you see, we need your help. The birds need your help to protect them against the plume hunters and the hat makers. Please join our club." Soon, there were over 10,000 junior members of the Audubon Society in the state of Massachusetts. And Audubon societies were formed in other states. More children joined. So here's a picture of a hunter down in Florida going after these egrets who have these beautiful snowy white feathers. So they were especially attractive to a lot of these hunters, looking for those very pretty feathers to decorate with. The membership in Boston continued to grow, and the meetings were always lively. The orange groves in Florida this year are suffering because there are too many dead hummingbirds on hats and not enough in the groves eating the pests that spoil the fruit, said Miss Harriet Richards, the secretary of the society. "Let's get the farmers on our side. Send out a letter," Mina said. So looks like at a market stall where you see tons of apples, but really no oranges, very few oranges. And here is somebody with those hummingbirds on their hat, wondering what might have happened, the connection between these birds and the farming. "Do have some more apple pie," Harriet offered, "and be happy it's not songbird pie, a specialty in some places, I'm told." All of the members stopped eating and looked at the apple pie on their plates. "Ghastly," whispered Mr. William Brewster, and for one awful minute they all imagined songbirds instead of apples in their pies, warblers, nightingales, and robins. "I think," said Mina, slowly setting down her plate, "we better start getting some laws passed." So here's everyone imagining a bunch of songbirds in their pies instead of apples. You can see all these wonderful, colorful birds flying around. Looks like our peregrine falcon has finished eating her bird. She wouldn't mind if it was songbird pie, huh? In the club, everybody was equal. The women and the men of the society wrote up their ideas together and then sent the gentlemen to talk to legislators in the State House and to members of Congress in Washington, D.C. to press for the passage of laws to save the birds. They were successful. An act was passed in 1903 to protect herons and bitterns, two popular hat birds, from hat makers, forbidding them to sell, display, or even possess the feathers. In 1904, there was another victory when a law was passed to protect shore, marsh, and beach birds. So here we have all of these different birds here, and somebody looking at them. I'll point out, it doesn't really say in the book, but it looks like all of these are birds that don't exist anymore, that are extinct. A lot of them due to overhunting, like the dodo, the heath hen, and then this looks like a giant auk. So you can see somebody looking at them, stuffed examples of them in a museum, but probably not able to see them out in the wild. So luckily, they started getting some of these laws passed. Let's see what else happens. Soon, there were laws against hunting birds during their breeding seasons. And then a federal law was passed preventing the importation of feathers from Europe and the tropics for hats. The word about birds had spread all the way to England, where Queen Victoria had announced that she would never again wear a feather for fashion. But Mina and Harriet were still far from happy. "What good is a law if it isn't enforced?" Mina moaned one day as she stood looking out the window at a woman passing by with a pheasant's wing raking the air above her. "You can't arrest the lady for wearing the hat." "But you can arrest the supplier of the feather," Harriet said. She tapped her head lightly as if to give a little jostle to her brains. "There are rumors about secret feather warehouses." She spoke softly. "I think we should make a few inquiries." So here's somebody wearing that big pheasant hat. Here's these two women plotting in the parlor. I'll point out this too. Here's a wonderful individual on top of a very big old-fashioned bicycle. This book has a lot of little details. I don't know if I'm picking up on all of them. So the two ladies with Harriet's husband, Augustus, took the train to New York City, where they were not so well known. They got as gussied up as two Boston ladies who loved birds and hated fashion could manage. They sashayed down Fifth Avenue in fancy dresses and wore elaborate hats with streamers and ribbons, but no feathers. Into the fanciest hat store the two cousins and Augustus Hemingway pranced. So you see all these very fancy, fine folks with feathers all over still, like the ones in the background you can see. Here's people walking around. And here are our two heroes here, walking into this very fancy hat store. What are they going to do in there? "I want to buy my wife and dear cousin each a hat, a feathered hat," Augustus announced. The salespeople began fluttering around the prosperous-looking threesome. "What will it be, madams? Egrets or doves? A little cloche covered with owl feathers, or this broad-brimmed hat with the Arctic tern? Is it not spectacular on the blue felt, just as if it were plunging into the sea?" The two ladies swallowed their disgust and muffled their anger. After all, there were more important things at stake. By the end of the shopping expedition, they, alas, had to buy two hats. But they also had the name of the feather supplier, with a warehouse in Baltimore where millions of dead birds and tons of plumes were stored. With this information, they went directly to the authorities. So here are these very fancy hats with all of these birds. Here are the very excited hat makers who are trying out all these different hats on them. Some are very dismayed heroes over here on the side. I think this is an American kestrel wing here. Actually, it looks just like one with a kind of feather pattern. Soon after, on a rainy May day, the cousins sat sipping tea. Harriet had just bitten into a crisp wafer when, like a tidal wave, Augustus burst into the parlor. "Ladies," he held a newspaper aloft in his hand, "you've won!" "We what?" said Mina. She and Harriet held their breath. "Won, dear cousin and dear wife. 26,000 illegal gull skins destined for hats of fashion were seized last night from the Baltimore warehouse. They have shut it down, taken the skins, and arrested the owner." Augustus paused. His rain-slicked face beamed with pride. "The law has been enforced." So here we have our startled cat over here in the corner, our two cousins drinking tea, and Augustus bursting in with a newspaper, excited in the rain. Mina looked at her cousin. "Harriet, we won!" But Harriet said nothing, for Harriet Hemingway never spoke with her mouth full, even when she won. So here they are, hugging and celebrating. Here is, I love this. This is one of those John Audubon, kind of wonderful, James Audubon, wonderful paintings. And this kind of rosette spoonbill seeming to walk right off the painting. Looks like it maybe scared the cat. So here's a little summary here at the back that I'll just read. Harriet Hemingway, who was born in 1858 and lived until 1960, and Mina Hall, 1859 to 1951, were real people. All of the other people mentioned by name in the story were also real and members of the Audubon Society. Much of the information on early activities pursued by the Society was gathered by reviewing archival material at the Audubon headquarters in Lincoln, Massachusetts. At the turn of the 20th century, there were many women like Harriet and Mina who wanted to participate more widely in society. In particular, they wanted the right to vote. Such women were smart enough to realize that if they wished to be taken seriously, where are we going? Oh, she's coming over here to drink some water here. Oh, I had hoped that she would do this. I'm just going to quick move this down so we can see her a little bit better. Sorry for the shaky camera here for a moment, but I want to make sure you can watch her if she does decide to take a little bath. I'll keep reading while she does that. If they wanted to be taken seriously, having a dead bird perched on their hat would not further their cause. The bird hat protest movement became linked in subtle ways with suffrage, the right of voting. I based elements of my story, this is from the author, Kathryn Lasky. I based elements of my story on ideas presented by Jennifer Price's, this is a book title, When Women Were Women, Men Were Men, and Birds Were Hats, which eloquently describes the links between the two movements in this country. It should be noted that there's no confirmed record of Harriet and Mina ever going into a hat store to buy hats to determine the source of the illegal plume trade. There were stories, however, of their finding out about an illegal warehouse. I took the liberty of imagining how they might have come upon such information. It did not seem plausible to me, given the social conventions of the time, that these two well-born, gentle but determined women would set out alone to track down the culprits. A more reasonable course of action, I felt, was one in which they might visit a hat store in the company of Harriet's husband and ask some leading questions. All other incidents in the book are based on true events. Harriet and Mina were not the first people to become involved in bird protection, and the Massachusetts Audubon Society was not the first Audubon Society. It was, however, the first that endured and had impact. It is generally recognized that the Massachusetts organization, started by Harriet and Mina, was the driving force behind the bird protection movement, and the most effective in terms of its impact on legislation and education, and of heightening the awareness of the general public to environmental concerns. The society still exists, and aside from working in a broad range of areas concerning the environment, it has most recently been responsible for reintroducing endangered and threatened populations, including such species as the peregrine falcon, the bald eagle, the loon, and the osprey. So that has been She's Wearing a Dead Bird on Her Head by Kathryn Lasky, with these wonderful illustrations by David Catrow. And it looks like our peregrine falcon here cleaned off a little bit. You got to make sure you get all of the kind of bits of quail off of your feet and off of your beak. As a slight follow-up to this book, so in addition to some of the laws that were mentioned in the book, all of this ultimately led to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. So a law that was passed just 102 years ago. And this was a law that was between the United States and Canada. And it's a law that protects over 800 species of birds, all of our native birds here in North America. So it protects all of them by preventing anyone from having any of their body parts, including their feathers or their feet or their wings or their nests or their eggshells, all things that people might encounter outside in the wild. But since we have no way of proving how people got them, the best way to protect all of these species is by saying that no one should have any of these pieces. So this has been a really important law for protecting a lot of our native wildlife. I also wanted to read this book with a peregrine falcon since, as it kind of mentioned at the very end of the book, these are birds that were very locally endangered as a species here in North America, especially for us here in kind of the Midwestern region, kind of in the central parts of Canada and the US. Our peregrine falcons were actually locally extinct, or what we call extirpated. We didn't have any peregrine falcons here, especially kind of in the middle of the 1900s, from kind of the late 1950s into the 1960s. So it took a lot of work to kind of get these birds' populations back healthy again after they had really been reduced by a pesticide or kind of a spray that you can put out to kill insects. So this pesticide called DDT caused a lot of damage to peregrine falcons and a lot of other birds as well. I think a few weeks ago we read a book about Rachel Carson and her book Silent Spring that really caused a lot of that environmental movement in the 60s and 70s. So it took a lot of work to bring these peregrine falcons back. So the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is another big part of that, of making sure that we protect these birds from any hunting. I mean, we did lose a few species. One of the most kind of interesting and I think kind of saddest stories and maybe best cautionary tales is the passenger pigeon, which was a kind of pigeon that was native to here in North America that would fly around in flocks numbering in the millions. It would actually, the stories that people have written down are that these birds would fly overhead and it would make everything look very dark, like a big cloud was passing overhead, because there were so many birds flying overhead that they would block out the sun. These flocks were so large. And because of overhunting, those birds actually went extinct in the early 1900s. So we don't actually have an entire species of bird that used to number in the millions and millions that we actually lost due to hunting. So these Migratory Bird Treaty Acts and all the other laws that both these women and a lot of other people worked really hard to pass were actually really important in protecting the birds that we do have. So that way we can kind of get the number of birds back. Egrets and herons and bitterns were another example brought up in that book. And those are some birds that have magnificent feathers, so they were really in a lot of danger. And now we have really quite healthy populations of all of those birds, which is phenomenal. So all of this, along with protecting our habitats as well as protecting the individual birds, has really, really helped. So all that being said, I'm going to quick scroll through and see if I missed any questions that came up. I saw a couple things pop up. Oh, yeah, somebody brought up the Carolina parakeets as well. We actually had a species of parakeet that was native to North America that also went extinct around that time as well in the early 1900s. So that's another great example of a bird that just does not exist anymore because of that overhunting. So especially right now, since we know here, getting into the 2000s, we know that we're having some major extinction events, not just birds, but all sorts of animals, especially our insects, our amphibians, a lot of our reptiles too are especially prone since they're so sensitive to kind of environmental changes. Really important to kind of think about all of those other animals that we have already lost, and really think about them as very kind of cautionary tales of what we can do to improve how we relate to the animals around us outside in the wild and making sure we're doing everything that we can for them. A lot of people really enjoyed this book. I'm so glad. This one was brought in by one of our staff members who found it while she was kind of cleaning out some bookshelves. So these have been wonderful books brought in by folks, which has been fantastic. So I've been really appreciating the books lately. Kind of searching around, trying to find some really, really good ones for us. I don't see any other kind of questions or comments on here. So if anyone has any last kind of questions, I will say, since I didn't really talk about her at the beginning, this peregrine falcon, we call her Artemis. She's actually a bird who was initially actually raised in captivity. So she was, or hatched in captivity near people. She was raised by her parents, by other peregrine falcons. So she knows how to be a peregrine falcon. But she was actually used for the sport of falconry. And especially when we're talking about peregrine falcon conservation, these falconers also played a really big role and continue to play a really big role. Since they were a lot of the people who were really able to help with replenishing or kind of getting back those numbers of peregrines with that captive breeding and releasing of a lot of peregrine falcons. That's where a lot of the, basically kind of a lot of the genetics of our peregrine falcons here in the Midwest actually comes from a mix of birds that were actually already in captivity for falconry. So they were really, really important in helping to preserve peregrine falcons and get them back out into the wild in this area. So really, really important. So this bird actually was initially a bird intended for falconry. Unfortunately, she was not particularly good at it. She was not flying very high. We don't know exactly why, but she just wasn't able to get that full high flight that peregrine falcons need to be able to dive down on their prey. So since she wasn't really able to do that, the falconer asked if we would take her on as an educator bird. And luckily for us, and luckily for her, she's been a phenomenal addition. She's great at teaching. So not great at her first job, but excellent at her second job of teaching people about peregrine falcons. So she's about 20 years old this year, if I recall correctly. So about 20 years old is a fairly senior peregrine falcon. That's typically kind of the upper limit of how old they usually live out in the wild. About 15 to 20 years is pretty normal. Usually the birds will live a little bit longer with us since they don't really have to worry about some of the effects of old age since we have our excellent veterinarians just right downstairs keeping good tabs on them. Plus, great quality food, don't have to worry about migrating, don't have to deal with as many of the elements or any kind of competition from other peregrine falcons. So a little bit more low stress kind of lifestyle. So she's just, she finished up eating her quail. We'll get her back outside here so she can go enjoy and sit out in the snow a little bit here, get some of that good natural weather that we get here in Minnesota. And then somebody did, was there a recent attempt to overturn the Migratory Bird Act? Yeah, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is, can have to be quite interesting. There have been some kind of movements to kind of change, not the law itself so much, but usually how it is enforced and applied, especially with kind of regards to the intention behind if any birds are harmed. So whether it was on purpose or on accident or kind of an incidental thing, like maybe setting up a, some sort of wind turbine or something like that that might damage birds. Was that intentional or not? So kind of some people interested in kind of thinking about how the law is actually kind of applied. Has usually been more of the kind of efforts recently, but there have been some efforts to change how that law is applied and kind of how it's enforced. So definitely something to keep an eye on if that is something that you are really passionate about and really care about. I encourage people to look into the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. It's been such an important basis for conservation in the United States and is one of our kind of most powerful tools that we have at our disposal to make sure that these birds are all staying safe and protected out in the wild. So always a really good one to keep tabs on and keep an eye out on to make sure that we're really doing everything we can to keep all of these bird species safe. Like the book was talking about, these can affect us too. If we're missing some of our native wildlife, like our hummingbirds, for example, we might have a lot of problems with the food that we eat. might kind of throw everything out of balance. So we really want to keep all of these birds really safe and keep their populations as healthy as possible. And that can only do good things for us too. Keeping birds healthy out in the environment is going to keep us healthy too, since we live in the same environment as all of these birds do. So with that, thank you all so much for joining me for more Reading with Raptors and talking about some important laws that protect our birds with She's Wearing a Dead Bird on Her Head. We will see you all next week. In the meantime, if you're interested in learning more, definitely check out our website. We're at theraptorcenter.org, or keep tabs on this Facebook page. We've got lots of great videos and things coming up. So keep an eye out for that. Keep learning and exploring, and hopefully anybody who is experiencing this late fall weather is keeping warm and safe whenever you're out and about. Otherwise, everyone have a great rest of your week. We will see you next week for more Reading with Raptors. Bye, everyone.